Welcome back. This is our third and last session of the day. The chairperson of this session is President of the country Green Crescent Nigeria, Mr. Alhaji Odi Kongila Muhammad, who will be joined by our most valuable speakers. First of all, I would like to briefly introduce our session speakers. Professor Mark Potenza, joining us from the USA, is the director of the Center of Excellence in Gambling Research and faculty at the Yale University School of Medicine. Today, he will deliver his presentation titled Gaming, Pornography, Viewing, and Problematic Forms of Interest Used During COVID-19. Professor David Hodgins, joining us from Canada, is faculty in the Department of Psychology at the University of Calgary. Today, he will deliver his presentation titled How Much is Too Much? Developing Lower Risk Gambling, Guidance Using International Data. Mr. Daniel Spritzter, joining from Brazil, is a PhD candidate in the Psychiatry and Behavioral Science at the Federal University of Rio Grande do Sul. If I pronounce wrongly, I'm so sorry. Today, he will deliver his presentation titled Microtransaction in Gaming. At the end of the session, the speakers have been reserved 5 minutes each during which to answer questions from the audience. As always in every session, of course, I now leave the floor to Mr. Alhaji Odi Kongila Muhammad. The stage is yours, Mr. Muhammad.
Okay, stage is mine. Thank you very much, my dear sister. I've been following the master ceremony since 7 o'clock in the morning, and you are still as vibrant as ever. I want to welcome each and every one of you on the platform as we move gradually to the end of today's session. I want to promise you that the last three resource people who are going to address us will do justice to the various topics that have been given to them. You should just sit back and relax. I also want to express my sincere appreciation to the Turkish Green Crescent for always being in the forefront of the fight against all form of addiction. I remember since 2012, the issue of technology addiction was just emerging, and they are already at it. So I have no doubt in my mind that the various speakers that have been chosen for this afternoon presentation would do justice the same way the others have done since morning. So we just plead that you give them all the necessary attention that they so deserve. As usual, the question and answer session will avail you the opportunity to interact with them, but not until after all the presentations are taken. And we want to go straight to invite the first presenter, who is going to do justice to gaming, pornography, viewing, and problematic form of internet use during COVID. It's my pleasure to invite Professor Mark Potenza. I don't know whether if I pronounce the name well, but you have the floor. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. I'll begin sharing my screen. And thank you all for, thank the hosts for inviting me to this important series of presentations. I'll be talking today on problematic internet use during COVID-19. I have a series of disclosures with respect to relationships with gaming, gambling, legal, and pharmaceutical entities. And I would propose that COVID-19 has led to many changes for people around the world. And many of these have been stressful changes with respect to changes in work, concerns about finances, health, and other uncertainties. And during these times, this stress may be impacting their mental health and behaviors. So during the pandemic, there have been a number of restrictions put into effect that have varied somewhat from jurisdiction to jurisdiction with respect to physical or spatial distancing, as well as other restrictions. And during these times, the internet has served many purposes. And with the changes in internet use that have occurred during COVID-19, there have been both advantages and disadvantages, or negative and positive changes that have occurred. Some of the negative changes may reflect problematic or addictive forms of internet use, whereas some of the positive changes is that people are becoming more comfortable, for example, conducting conferences like the one today in order for us to share information across different locations geographically. With respect to internet use concerns, so-called behavioral addictions like gaming and gambling disorders are particularly perhaps concerning, given that they may be conducted online, as may another set of behaviors, some of which we've heard about earlier today, such as social media or network use, but also pornography viewing, shopping and buying, and other forms of internet use behaviors that may or may not be considered addictive in nature. But these and other behaviors should be studied in the setting of COVID-19 and in different jurisdictions as the COVID-19 pandemic has impacted different places around the world in different fashions at different times. So some of the data that I'll be presenting today come from the earlier part of the pandemic, and I think it will be important for us to continue to gather data throughout. So first, I'll talk a bit about problematic online gaming. And during the early part of the pandemic, gaming increased. So Verizon reported a 75% increase in gaming. Fortnite increased by 70% in Italy early in the pandemic. And Steam reported a record high 20 million users early in the pandemic. As well, Twitch reported a 10% increase in viewership. And so while these changes may have been occurring in the onset, I think it will be important for us to continue to understand how the pandemic may be changing behaviors. During the early part of the pandemic, the gaming industry promoted gaming and stated that gaming may increase socializing and reducing stress. And the World Health Organization seemingly expressed initial support, and I think in subsequent communications reported recommendations regarding balanced gaming to be mindful of the potential concerns of gaming disorder. So as I mentioned, we should continue to collect data to see how changes that may be occurring in youth, including with respect to disruptions in schooling that may have created more time for gaming, may have impacted gaming behaviors, and the potential for these changes to be longer term, for example, if they become instantiated and constitute difficult to break habits. So gambling during COVID-19, there have been changes previously noted with respect to financial crises, where gambling has increased during these times. However, during COVID-19, it was a complicated situation, considering that land-based casinos, for example, closed, and there was a cessation of sporting events early in the pandemic, at least a number of sporting events. During that time, there were reports of increased gambling on amateur sports, and an increase in online gambling was also noted. And this is concerning, given that online casino gambling has been linked to high levels of indebtedness and gambling problems. Out of a treatment program in Barcelona, it was noted that a significant number of individuals reported significant anxiety and depression during the early part of the pandemic, with about 1 in 8 individuals reporting worsening of their gambling. So another potentially problematic behavior on the internet is with pornography viewing. It's a widely prevalent behavior. During the onset of the pandemic, Pornhub, a major pornography supplier on the internet, reported in March of 2020 that there was a more than 10% increase in viewership, with a subsequent report in April of 2020 that it was up over 20% from the prior year. Some of these increases may relate to stress or other factors like confinement or decreased casual sex opportunities. And we need to, I would argue, understand these behaviors better. Another factor that may have contributed to increases in pornography use was potentially by the pornography providers promoting use during COVID-19 and making premium services free in specific jurisdictions during the pandemic. So this is graphically from 2020, increases in viewership over the months from late February to the middle of March during the onset of the pandemic. And this is a copy of a promotional advertisement where they promoted flattening the curve, either by self-isolating and enjoying the premium videos for free, or practicing spatial distancing and hand washing. And one can see that at the times when the premium services became freely available, there was a large spike in increase in viewership here, going from March 16th to March 17th in Spain. In Italy, where the premium services had been made freely available a few days earlier, one saw a similar spike up to 57%, but then a gradual decrease in the week following, or in the days following. One can see in other jurisdictions similar patterns without the spike, similar in Germany, as well as in Hong Kong. So the increased viewership was not the only change that appeared during the pandemic. Searches for coronavirus-related pornography increased, and by mid to late March of 2020, over 9 million searches had been reported. And perhaps most concerning was the timing of increases in pornography viewing that became most prominent at 1 a.m. to 3 a.m. across jurisdictions. And these patterns raise questions about unhealthy use with respect to sleep behaviors and the motivations that may drive individuals to view pornography during the middle of the night. Other increases were seen during midday, and questions arise regarding this, perhaps relating to work-related changes or other factors. And this is graphically a view of the increases going from midnight to 11 p.m. And one can see that these two peaks that I had mentioned during the middle of the night, according to local jurisdiction time, as well as during the middle of the day. So from a developmental perspective, I think this is also concerning, as adolescents often view pornography on the internet. And a study out of Korea found that using the internet mostly for pornography had the highest odds of problematic internet use, a 4.5-fold increase as compared to information searching. And during the pandemic, data out of Hong Kong suggested that different forms of internet viewing might relate to psychological distress differently at different phases of the pandemic. So this was a study of a little over 1,200 school-aged children, and looked at problematic gaming and problematic smartphone use and psychological distress over 3 time points, with the first prior to the pandemic, and then the second and third wave during initial stages of the pandemic. And what one can see here is that going from wave 1 before the pandemic to wave 2 during the early part of the pandemic, there was a relationship between problematic gaming and psychological distress that was not observed for problematic smartphone use and psychological distress at wave 2. Going from wave 2 during the onset of the pandemic and then to wave 3 into the pandemic, gaming there was not this relationship with problematic gaming and psychological distress emerging, but there was with problematic smartphone use and psychological distress. And it raises questions about whether the pandemic may have influenced how people were engaging in gaming, perhaps more so for social reasons during the pandemic when one could not meet in person, but perhaps getting news or other information via smartphone use may have led to psychological distress. So these are speculative at present time, but I think warrants consideration. So during the pandemic, given these changes in internet usage, the cost guidance that focuses on problematic internet use, the COST initiative generated a guidance to help individuals prevent problematic internet use. And so a paper was generated and was published in Comprehensive Psychiatry in July of 2020. And there were some general recommendations with respect to maintaining health overall, with respect to having daily routines, healthy sleep, exercise, hydration, personal hygiene, relaxation time, social activities in a spatially safe manner, and as well as having family and personal time and space. And it would be important to keep informed about health information without becoming obsessed with it. But some of the specific recommendations regarding problematic internet use related to self-monitoring and regulation of screen time, monitoring of children's behaviors, considering digital well-being apps, using analog technical tools, for example, non-smartphone connected clocks, so that one is not tempted to overuse the internet when checking time, and then maintaining contact with friends and relatives and seeking help as needed for internet use behaviors. Also, more recently, the COST initiative has generated a Learning to Deal with Problematic Usage of the Internet booklet, and this is available online. And this covers multiple types of problematic use of the internet and provides information on the course of problematic use of the internet and co-occurring disorders, and covers assessment and intervention information and provides practical tips. So some of the tips for parents include making sure that the content of the internet that children are engaging in is age appropriate, that there may be gradual age-related introduction of material as well as devices, age-related durations of usage, screen-free meal times, no screen time 1 hour before bedtime, given the impact that internet use can have on sleep behaviors in terms of engagement as well as the light emission, balancing screen time and physical activity, and ensuring sufficient sleep time. Additional tips for parents, turning off digital devices when not in use, avoiding device use for emotional regulation, creating tech-free areas within the living environment where that is possible, balancing screen usage with non-screen hobbies and interests, having clear and consistent rules, playing video games if one is going to do so with others and not doing so in a solitary fashion, and having regular conversations about online activities. And then finally, also warning children about online dangers, encouraging asking for help, for example, when being cyberbullied, teaching online ethics, manners, and safe behaviors, being self-aware of technology behaviors, being aware of notifications, for example, when muted, so that one can intervene appropriately, making phones distant while studying, and being aware that parents have this tremendous influence on children during development and throughout adolescence. So to be mindful of how best to interact with children. So we've also published a book on digital technologies and mental health. This has been published recently through Oxford University Press. And then in conclusion, internet use has changed during the pandemic. Online addictive behaviors may be on the rise, and I think it will be important for us to collect more information to determine the extent to which these are temporary increases that might be stress-related versus more ingrained behaviors that might be more difficult to break and may warrant clinical attention. The internet may be used for health promoting factors, and we should be mindful of this, particularly given during the pandemic, many people have switched to providing therapy via Zoom and other platforms, and that specific measures may help protect against excessive or problematic use of the internet, and that we need to understand and test these interventions. So I'd like to thank a large number of individuals, and thank you all for your attention.
Yeah, thank you so much, Professor Potenza, for that thought-provoking presentation. My esteemed member of the audience, you will agree with me that it was another good one. The presentation has been quite lucid and straightforward, and I'm sure it presents it in such a way that even if you have poor in comprehension, you'll understand. So thank you so much. Without wasting further time, I want to invite the second speaker to tell us how much is too much. And it's my pleasure to invite David Hudson from Brazil. You have the floor. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah.
Good afternoon. My name is David Hodgins, and I'm from the University of Calgary in Canada. And I'm very honored to be invited to speak in this meeting. I'm going to talk about a project where we developed a set of lower-risk gambling guidelines using international data. I want to start by talking about funding. So I received consulting funds from the Canadian Centre on Substance Use and Addiction for this project, and also research funds from the Erdogan Research Institute. The overall project was funded by a foundation in Canada called Mis sur Toi, that has the mandate of preventing gambling-related harms. I want to acknowledge my colleagues. I co-chaired the scientific working group for this project with Matthew Young from the Canadian Centre on Substance Use and Addiction, and we worked with a team of experts from across Canada in developing the details, methodological details of the project. What I'm going to do today is tell you a little bit about the background of the project. I'm going to introduce the lower risk gambling guidelines at the beginning quickly, and then delve into some details about how they were developed, including the quantitative limits and some of the validation research that we conducted. I will then end by providing the recommendations for the final content and the details of how we're presenting them. So why lower risk gambling guidelines? Essentially, there's a lack of evidence-based guidelines on how people can gamble in a manner that poses minimal risk to gamblers and to those around them. So the advice that we provide individuals, for example, is improving over time, but it's not very specific. So we tell people that they should only bet amounts that they can afford to lose. We encourage people to take breaks on a regular basis. We tell people to set a limit, a time limit for their gambling, but we don't give them details on what a reasonable time limit, a reasonable frequency of gambling is, or a reasonable amount of money to gamble. So there really is a need for evidence-informed lower risk gambling guidelines, not only to help individuals manage their gambling, but also for their families and communities and other individuals who are interested in minimizing gambling-related harm. The guidelines are also relevant to industry and to regulators in encouraging people to gamble in ways that will minimize the likelihood of harm. Guidelines are available in other areas, of course. So here's a few examples from Canada. These are lower risk cannabis guidelines that in Canada, recreational cannabis use was legalized about 2 years ago. And so a group of us looked into the literature to see what kind of information was available that could be used to provide advice to individuals in managing their cannabis use. And you can see there's a number of different recommendations, and they're pretty general, which reflects the state of the research available. So we encourage people, for example, to limit and reduce how often they use cannabis, but we don't give details about that. In other areas, we're much more specific because there is a longer history of research to use in developing guidelines. So, for example, these are Canada's food guidelines, and they're much more specific. They give much more specific advice to individuals about the types of food and the amounts of food that they should consume. Probably the best example for this purpose is our drinking guidelines, alcohol drinking guidelines. So in Canada, we have over the years had different versions of guidelines, advice to individuals to minimize harm related to alcohol. And these are routinely reviewed and refined as more research becomes available. And they're fairly specific in terms of the advice that's provided. So, lower risk gambling guidelines. So this is our final product, and I'm just going to show it to you quickly here, and then I'll talk more about it later. So basically, we provide some quantitative guidelines on how much money, how often, how frequently someone should gamble, and the types of gambling that they should do, along with some qualifiers, sort of information that might change how you would use these guidelines. And then we also have a set of tips for ways to approach gambling and how to think about gambling as well. So I'm going to talk about how these were developed. We started by publishing actually a research plan. So this is available and it provides a lot more detail about exactly how we approached the project. But one of the first issues we had was, what do we mean by harm? So if you look at drinking-related harm, alcohol-related harm, it's pretty clear that there are biological effects, physical effects that are real markers for harm. We don't have something like that in gambling. So we need to look at sort of a range of harms. And of course, the most obvious harm related to gambling is financial harm. People accruing large debts and spending money that they cannot afford to gamble, as well as relationship conflicts, emotional distress, and stress-related health problems. So we settled on using a very broad definition of harm that was produced by a group in Australia, that a taxonomy of harms that is a very broad definition. Okay, so to develop the quantitative part of the guidelines, essentially the methodology involves using risk curves or putting together risk curves. And so this is a risk curve in terms of how often people are gambling. And this is the percentage of people who are experiencing some sort of harm. So, for example, this line here is an indication of betting more than they can afford to spend. And essentially what we're doing with risk curves is we're looking at where does this begin to rise? You know, is it here? Is it here? Is it here? Across different indicators to see where the best cut points are in terms of an increasing level of harm. Of course, we can look at it visually, but we also use statistical methods for indicating the best areas of cutting points. So to do these kinds of analysis, of course, you need good quality data sets. And this is where our international partners come into it. We did an inventory of possible data sets from really anywhere in the world that would provide the information at a population level that we would be able to use to develop risk curves. And we found a number of different, good quality data sets. Some of them are longitudinal data, some of them are cross-sectional data. And you can see they reflect mostly Western, all Western countries, Western-style countries, Australia, New Zealand, France, Finland, Sweden, Iceland, a number of data sets from Canada and the United States. Unfortunately, we don't have any data from Turkey or from Asian countries or African countries, for that matter. So the next step was to conduct the research, conduct the risk curves analysis on the suitable data sets. So essentially, we brought the partners together, we worked out the methodological details, and everyone went back and conducted risk curves on their data set. One of the details that we needed to work out was what indicators of gambling do we have in most of the data sets. And what we had is indicators of expenditure, indicators of frequency, and indicators of the different types of gambling that an individual was engaged in. All of the data sets used a measure called the Problem Gambling Severity Index. So this was their measure of gambling disorder or problematic gambling. And a number of the items on this measure could be used to indicate the harm categories that we were interested in. So financial, relationship, emotional, psychological, and health harms. So, essentially all of the partners went back and calculated risk curves. And so these are examples of risk curves that were provided. So this is, for example, some information from Canada, and this is the number of days of gambled. This is the harm associated. This is longitudinal data, and you can see that on this indicator that it begins to rise at the 5 to 8 day level. This is similar information from a longitudinal study in the United States. So we had lots and lots of risk curves, of course, to compare different indicators in different countries. And what was amazing was that there was really a convergence of results. So not surprisingly, the shape of all the curves were similar, but not only that, the range of limits that were ideal were similar, amazingly similar across different countries. So what were they? So this was our general ranges, looking at summarizing the data from Canada and from other countries. So basically, if a person gambled 5 to 8 days, more than 5 to 8 days per month, their risk of harm was increasing. Or in Canadian dollars, $55 to $120 per month, or in terms of monthly income, 1 to 3% of gross income. We wanted to look at duration of gambling episodes, and we really didn't find consistent results there. So there was insufficient quality data to assess this. But if a person was gambling in more than 2 to 6 different game types in a month, then that was involved increased risk. All of our partners then went back and looked at the range, these ranges of risks, and looked more specifically at the increase of risk with different potential sort of cut points. So this is an example of the data that were generated to help us refine specifically where does the risk of harm increase within these broader ranges. So you can see here, this is an example, is the percentage of income. You can see that relative to people who gambled very little, the risk increased more than 4 times at the 1% mark, 1 to 2% mark, and so forth. So we were able to kind of look at the data sets from this perspective to see where the risk of harm increased in a way that was particularly concerning. So at the same time, we conducted a series of other research studies to help, validate and refine the decisions we needed to make about the cutoff points. So I'm not going to talk about all of these, but we did a couple of literature reviews. We looked specifically at the literature on the effect of substance use on gambling behavior. And we did a large meta-analysis of factors associated with elevated risk of gambling harm. And you'll see where this comes into the final recommendations when I present them in a few minutes here. We also conducted an online survey of over 2,000 Canadians who gamble, where we presented information about the guidelines to see if people would understand them, would find them acceptable, would find them too high, too low. And we also conducted qualitative interviews and focus groups with people who gamble at different levels to get their input into the concept of guidelines and the details of guidelines. So the online survey, I'll just say a little bit about that. So the objectives were to understand the strategies that people use spontaneously to control gambling, and then to solicit opinions on our early drafts of our low-risk gambling guidelines. Perceptions of the draft guidelines, basically people preferred the more conservative guidelines of the ranges that we had developed quantitatively. So this is an example. We asked people, we presented a set of guidelines that involved people gambling no more than 4 days a month or 6 days a month. And we asked them whether that felt about right, a little too high, very high, too low, or very much too low, or whether it was unclear. And you can see that more people felt like the 4 days per month guideline was about right than they felt about the 6 days per month. Okay, so a series of studies were done to validate and refine the information that we got quantitatively from the international partners, and this is the final content. And I'm going to, basically it's a one-page, the public presentation of the data is this one-page poster that's available, but I'm going to show you the details. So here are the quantitative limits. So basically, the advice is to reduce your risk of experiencing harms related to gambling. You should gamble no more than 1% of your household income per month. And we help people calculate what that would be. These are Canadian dollars of different household income levels. We advise people to gamble no more than 4 days per month, and to gamble regularly at no more than 2 types of games. And then we give people an indicator of what we mean by types of games, and some general information that some types of gambling are potentially more problematic than other types of gambling. So slot machines, fast-paced games, for example. We provide qualitators. Now, this came from our meta-analysis of factors associated with problematic gambling. These guidelines may not be suitable for you if you are experiencing problems from alcohol, cannabis, or other drug use, if you're experiencing problems with anxiety or depression, or if you have a personal or family history of problems with gambling. And then we provide a set of safer gambling tips. This came from a literature review we did, and it's similar to the types of general information that that have been provided already in public health approaches to educating people about non-problematic gambling. We actually provide some information about what we mean by harms related to gambling. Some of the focus group people said that this was important information. And we also, from our meta-analysis, have a kind of a final statement about motivations for gambling. So we encourage people to think about their reasons for gambling. And if they're gambling to escape problems, then that is strongly related to likelihood of experiencing harm from gambling. So we encourage people to think about their motivations. And then finally, we provide people with information or information about other resources. So if people are experiencing gambling-related harms that are significant, or gambling disorder, then these are the resources that are available locally for individuals to access treatment services. So those are the guidelines. They haven't quite yet been released publicly. That's going to happen in September of this year. But they are, they're available. And certainly other jurisdictions, other countries are looking at following a similar process of developing guidelines for their own jurisdictions. We do not perceive these guidelines as being the solution to problematic gambling. So certain education of the public plays a small role in promoting a culture of moderation with regard to problematic behaviors generally, but gambling specifically. So we think that they play an important role, but of course, other policy initiatives, coordinated policy initiatives are also important. And we see these guidelines as potentially playing a role in those types of interventions as well. So having people set mandatory pre-commitment pre-commitment of gambling before they begin to gamble, for example, is a good strategy for providing harm. And these guidelines can provide some parameters that might be helpful in having people set personal guidelines for themselves in terms of how to limit their gambling. So I'll leave it at that. And I'm available now for questions. And also you can contact me afterwards. So thank you very much.
Yeah, wow. That's yet another excellent presentation. You will agree with me. I did promise you that from the beginning that you hadn't seen anything yet. The second presenter, Professor David Hoskin from Canada, has indeed done justice to the topic. How much is too much? He started by saying that a game should remain a game, and that you should eat well to live well. Well, I will want to quickly invite the next speaker, so that at the end of it all, we will do a quick summary of the presentation before the question and answer. It's my pleasure to invite another potential professor from Brazil, Daniel Spritzer, to tell us the micro transactions in gambling. Professor, you have the floor. Thank you. Daniel Spritzer, please, you have the floor.
Yeah. Hello, merhaba. Yeah. Hello, yes. Everyone. Just going to share my screen now. Just a second. Yeah. Okay. So I'd like to start by thanking my dear friends from the Turkish Green Crescent Society for the invitation to participate in this highly important event. And it's a great honor for me to share the session with colleagues that I greatly admire, like Mark and David, and from whom I learned so much. And today I'm going to talk about microtransactions, which is a topic that portrays the convergence between gaming and gambling. And the idea is to explore the role of microtransactions in the current gaming scenario, its different subtypes, the mechanisms involved, and also its association with problem gambling. So To begin, it's important to remember that we're talking about a multi-billion-dollar industry that will continue to grow in the following years, and it's expected to exceed $200 billion at the end of 2023. It's an industry that from the early 1970s until the last decade had a business model based on selling games to the players, but in recent years has made much more profit by offering these games for free. So how is that possible, actually? A large part of this is explained from a different monetization strategy in which the purchases now occur inside the game. That monetization already accounts for more than half of the revenue of many game companies. So as there is no need to pay anything to start playing these games, they can be made available to a much bigger audience. And in addition, microtransactions are also advertised as a more inclusive alternative that would enable a better gaming experience, even for those who don't have as much skill or as much time to play the game. Because as long as you have money, everything will be fine. So before any more theoretical definitions, I'll invite you to go back with me in time a little bit in order to understand, based on some historical milestones, this new way through which games are now making so much money. So the year was 1990, and the game was Double Dragon 3. At a certain moment of the game, we entered a store, a market, that offers us the possibility to insert additional coins to buy different characters, extra power, and weapons. And it's really interesting to notice that this, which is one of the first known reports of microtransactions, occurred in an arcade game way before the online games as we know them now. So, one decade later, the first free-to-play online games were developed and popularized the microtransactions revenue model. And at the end of the first decade of this century, games like Farmville and Clash of Clans, for example, allowed microtransactions to use real-world money to buy in-game money, and with this in-game money to buy in-game items. With this, the value of each microtransactions might not be so clear to the player. And another important issue is that through microtransactions, it was also possible in these games to speed up many steps of the game, offering considerable advantage to the players and especially to the paying users. So more or less at the same time, Team Fortress 2 was the first game that was made available for free in this free-to-play model after years of being sold to players in a more traditional way. It was also one of the first games to feature a loot box, which is a box containing virtual items that players can buy, get, or open before they know exactly what they will find inside. And from this point on, many games started using these loot boxes as they were a very lucrative feature. But the majority of non-gamers ended up just hearing about loot boxes by the end of 2017, when the game Star Wars Battlefront 2 was released. So here in this game, since the release of the beta version, buying loot boxes was extremely relevant, important to the progression of the game. So characterizing it as a legitimate pay-to-win game. So, and the strong and negative reaction from the gamer community had huge consequences, including further press investigation and the first national regulations. Okay, so by definition, microtransaction is the use of small amounts of real-world money to buy in-game items or also in-game currency. But depending on what is being purchased or the frequency of these purchases, the transactions may not be that micro at all. So the purchased items may be, as we call it, cosmetic, like those that change the appearance of the player or the appearance of some item that the player owns, but doesn't interfere much in the game dynamics and doesn't give any in-game advantage to the player. And an example of this would be this skin, the skin of this machine gun, not the machine gun at all. So it's important to know that purely cosmetic items are no less important to the player, as they have a very significant role in social identity and also in peer recognition status. On the other hand, some items offer an advantage to the player within the game mechanics. And in FIFA, for example, getting better players makes a difference in the outcome of the match because they really increases the chances of beating the opponents. But microtransactions that offer so many in-game advantage are highly criticized for being part of the so-called pay-to-win scheme, where the outcome of the game is influenced much more by the purchases than the player's skill or commitment to the game. And both these cosmetic items and also the items that offer some in-game advantage can be purchased, simply put, in two ways. So they can be bought directly, like any internet purchases, or people can try their luck by opening a loot box. And as I mentioned before, when players buy a loot box, they're not sure of what they will find inside it. And this mechanism based on randomness is very important for the understanding of its effects on the players. So buying a loot box is much cheaper than buying some items directly in many situations, but the chance of getting these items in a loot box is also lower. And of course, and it's very important to see that purchases via loot box are seen by players as having a good value for their money. So nowadays, loot boxes are really popular. Almost half of the most important games feature microtransaction mechanisms involving loot boxes. And almost half of the players in some studies reported buying loot boxes in the previous year. And also very important is that 1/3 of teenagers between the ages of 11 and 16 have already opened a loot box. So there are three main risks related to buying loot boxes. The first one obviously is related to overspending. The second one is related to gaming disorder because loot boxes may end up increasing the person's engagement in gaming. But I will talk a little more today about the relationship between loot boxes and gambling. So for that, let's try to see exactly how the loot boxes work. So they can be earned via gameplay for free, like when you level up or when you reach a certain position in the ranking, in the game ranking. Or, of course, they can be purchased using in-game currency or real-world money. So, and inside them, you can find a randomly, a price, a virtual price, an item that is randomly generated. And also a very important feature is that in many games, actually, they actually allow you for trading the loot box prices, like exchanging or selling it to another player, or even withdrawing the money the corresponding to that item that you got. So sometimes it can be done within the game itself in an official marketplace in some games, or it can be done also through third-party websites that are also pretty common. And it's also possible to bet, to use these items to bet in casino games without using real-world money. So, depending on what one considers gambling and understands how loot boxes work, the similarities between them can be quite evident. So many countries are now regulating microtransactions and especially loot boxes. China, for example, requires the developers to report the probability of getting a certain item within a loot box. Belgium determined that buying loot boxes with real world money is gambling and ended up banning all loot boxes from the games. And Denmark and Netherlands have taken the view that it is only gambling when the loot box prices can be withdrawn and turned into cash. So, however, some game rating agencies say that loot boxes have nothing to do with gambling, but resemble more like a pack of cards or a Kinder Egg, as they have elements of surprise, and at the end, you always get something. But we're not pretty sure about that. So scientific studies on this topic have emerged as of 2018, and most of them showing a very significant association between spending on loot boxes and having gambling problems. And demonstrating also that the more money a person spends on loot boxes, the greater the severity of these gambling problems. And also this association has been found in adults and as well as in adolescents. So in addition, it's also interesting to see that the association with gambling is greater when loot boxes are sometimes offered for a limited time, also when they are offered for free in some games. That loot boxes containing rarer items are more arousing, rewarding, and also more urge-inducing. And also a question that in it for further studies whether the gambling problems occur with the purchasing of loot boxes only, or also with the purchasing of also non-random microtransactions. So, however, given that all these studies are cross-sectional, it's still unclear whether this association represents that loot box spending causes gambling problem, or if problem gamblers, for example, are more attracted to buying loot boxes, and or maybe a third option is that there is a general dysregulation in this in-game spending amongst problem gamblers, which are non-specific to the loot boxes itself. So there is little doubt actually that we need more adequate regulatory measures, like having age-appropriate marketing, certainly greater transparency and consumer advice on the odds for these random in-game rewards. Also, limit setting and parental control is very important, and definitely having additional parental advisories into games that feature loot boxes. So, in order for us to advocate for the development of these adequate regulatory measures, we must try to keep constantly up to date on this topic, which is not an easy task anyway. So due to the complexity of the monetization strategies, it's really important to consider games on a case-by-case basis. But also, at the same time, it's also necessary to examine the different types of monetization, like if you have random elements, the cosmetic versus the competitive options, whether you can cash out the money in an open economy, and their association with gambling symptoms and gambling-related harms. So, moreover, another interesting aspect to be evaluated is the influence of game streaming and esports on the expanding behavior of children and adolescents. And obviously we need longitudinal studies to try to understand this causal relationship between spending on loot boxes and gambling. And this need for constant updating must maybe extend beyond the limits of scientific literature in order for us to keep an eye on what is being developed and especially what is being played by people nowadays. So thank you very, very much for your attention.
Well, thank you very much, our last speaker, Daniel Springer, for yet another beautiful presentation on microtransactions and gambling. Before the question and answer sessions, I want to quickly do a simple recap of the three presentations, beginning with the last. Daniel Springer did inform us of the financial fortunes involved in the gaming industry. It's a multi-billion-dollar ventures, and the industrial players have made so much money to the extent that they even offer the various game and gambling free. And then within it, they kind of embed some form of microtransactions. And this has been where the problems is. The more you indulge, the more you become addictive. And at the end of it all, the disorder that's associated with it. This is the much I can say about what our brother did say, the last speaker. And then the second speaker also began by telling us that a game should remain a game, and that we must eat well to stay well. I think these two statements summarize the presentation. He did took us on the journey of how limit settings was arrived at, and how we should be able to recognize the various limits as far as gaming, pornography, and all these things are concerned. How much is much? How much? Less than 1% of your family income. Once you begin to cross that less than 1%, brother, you're already in trouble. And then you should also have less than 4 times. That is how often. That is, it should not be more than 4 per month, and then how many at least less than 2%. So on that, the detail of the presentations, I'm sure, will be sent to us. And finally, the first speaker did admonish us on the areas of the fact that internet use changed during COVID. He told us the negative and the positive side of it. The positive is the virtual webinars and interactions that we can do across the globe. It's indeed a very positive signs with the coming of the COVID, but it is not without its deleterious consequences. You also told us that the internet may be used for health promoting factors, and therefore most studies of the internet use during COVID pandemic over time is needed. These are some of, in brief, the summary of the three speakers. I will want the flow, the questions that are on the chat box to give further clarification to the presentations. I have here this person, I don't know. Well, you listen, and the person who is directly concerned will give a response. Is there any study that will show the correlation between personality trait and doing microtransactions regarding cosmetics or challenging items? I think this is to Daniel Sprinster. Yes. Do I read it again?
No, it's okay. Thank you very much, Mohammed.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah. So there are very few studies up to now that examine this personality characteristics of people who spend money in microtransactions. There's one very interesting study that shows that trying to establish some comparisons with gambling, that we have different characteristics or different risk factors for buying loot boxes, for example, and the personality characteristics that may be risk factors for engaging in problem gambling, in gambling behaviors, traditional gambling behavior. So, but we're still learning a lot from it now, and we still don't have a clear personality profile of people who spend money in microtransactions. I can say that we'll certainly have some developmental issues involved, like age is really a really important factor, and there was another question related to the child and adolescent spending money in these mechanisms that may be pretty similar to gambling. So this is, I think, one of the most critical points where like how, if we are stimulating people to, especially child and adolescents, to engage in underage gambling, for example.
All right, thank you very much. There's another question that says, what is the opinion about negative effect of gambling activities and gambling advertisement on social media? I think that's one we'll go to, I think our professor from Canada. Is it yours?
Yes. Yeah, so there's two parts to that question. One part is the effect of offering gambling through social media. And the other part is advertising gambling through social media. And both are potentially problematic, of course. Offering gambling through social media increases accessibility. And accessibility is related to the potential of harm. And we know that there is actually a link between online gambling and problem gambling. We don't know whether that is because online gambling is more dangerous, or whether people who have problems with gambling are attracted to online gambling because it is accessible, every day, all day, and there aren't the social restraints on a person's gambling when they're gambling on social media or through the internet. The other part of the question was about advertising, and advertising works, of course. People, companies spend huge amounts of money advertising, so of course it works. In lots of jurisdictions, there are limits, regulations on the type of message that you can use in promoting gambling, and in particular, that it can't be promoted in a way that increases cognitive distortions about gambling. So the message can't be that you can be a winner. It can't be that you can be good at this activity. The message has to be that it's fun. And I think that's an important restriction on advertising, but certainly advertising works.
Thank you very much, Prof. There's another question for Professor Potenza. What about qualitative studies or mixed method studies on pornography? Do you conduct qualitative project research or mixed method studies on pornography, especially on women experience? I don't know. Do you get the question?
I do get the question. Thank you.
Yes. And then there's another one closely related. Maybe you note it. Is there a relationship between client and personality trait?
Yes. So let me.
2 questions. Okay.
So thank you. Thank you for the important questions. So with the first, we have largely done more quantitative rather than qualitative research, but have begun to conduct some qualitative studies. But there have been some other groups that have used qualitative approaches to investigate aspects of pornography viewing, including with respect to women and pornography viewing. So much of the research that has been done on pornography viewing has typically involved males, particularly young adult men. But some of the research that has used qualitative methodology to study pornography viewing in women report different themes. So, for example, a study of 27 women found that some women, one of the themes that emerged was that pornography reproduces and promotes patriarchal aspects of sexuality. However, women also reported using pornography to reach a state of pleasure that may involve fantasy, and also thinking about the optimal ways of being sexually engaged with other individuals. I think this area certainly warrants more research, particularly as much research of pornography use has not considered changes in the content of pornography that has become more widely available on the internet over time.
Yeah, thank you very much for doing justice to the question. I want to quickly ask Dr. Daniel Spritzer, is it possible to say that socioeconomic level of the gamers is the key factor to take a part in the games with microtransactions? Is there any difference between low-income countries and high-income countries in terms of gaming with the loot box?
It's
you get the question with gaming with microtransactions.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
Is there any study to show? This is a lengthy question, but I'm sure you get the gist.
It's a very, very interesting point and very interesting research question to investigate. But nowadays, most, if not all of the studies on microtransactions were held in developed countries. So actually, I'm also really curious to see if we have these differences coming from like participation, engaging in microtransaction and loot boxes specifically, if they are different in high-income countries or in middle-income countries. Up to now, I think we have not enough information on that.
Yes. So thank you so much. I think with this, we have come to the end of our question and answer session. I want to thank each and every one of you profusely for doing justice to the topics assigned to you, and to also express my sincere gratitude to Yesela for yet another beautiful session. I've never been, I'm sure even the audience have never been disappointed. So on this note, I want to again thank each and every one of you, and to hand over to my sister who has been holding on since in the morning. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you from us, Mr. Elhaji Odi Kongila, for your wonderful moderation. Oh, if I pronounce wrong, I'm so sorry. I just catch your laugh. I'm so sorry. It's terrible.
It's okay.
Sorry, what's the correct one?
No, Muhammad Alhaji Odi Kongila.
Oh, it's
Kongila.
so hard for me.
It's okay, you tried, you did well.
I think Muhammad El-Haji is okay, right? Is it enough?
Audi Kongila.
Okay. Oh, okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for your gentle reaction. Thank you so much for your wonderful moderation. And I also wanted to thank our speakers for their wonderful presentation and contribution. And I would like to cordially thank all our speakers and estimated participants. The 5th International Congress of Technology Addiction will resume tomorrow on its last day with important topics and the contribution of valuable experts in the field. Until next time, have a nice evening. Efendim, International bir kongre olduğu için good one, have a good one. International bir kongre olduğu için
as this is an international congress, our master of ceremonies was saying goodbye in English, and he is repeating the same. She's repeating the same thing in Turkish for Turkish participants, extending thanks for all those who made their contribution, to the speakers, to the participants, and everyone who made this 5th Congress on technology addiction will continue tomorrow. We will have very respected experts who will be contributing tomorrow. I will briefly remind the names that will be among us, and you should not miss the Congress. From South Korea, Hae-Kook Lee, and from Australia, Daniel King of Austria, and from World Health Organization, Lataja Kaliger, and from Switzerland, Sofia, and from China, Xinglong, Zhao Tung, and from Thailand, Jam Adej, Game Quitter, Professor Kemal Sayar, Derya Yalaz, and Orhan Gürse, Professor Gültekin Öger, and Ümit Karaçetin, and Dr. Mehmet Dinç. These are the speakers of the tomorrow's sessions. They will be among us, and these are very reputable names in their respective fields, and we would like to see you among us tomorrow, and we are looking forward to listening to the esteemed experts and professors tomorrow. We will continue tomorrow, and we would like to say goodbye for today and see you tomorrow. Goodbye. This is the end of the day and the session for today.